trust and confidence were critical to my ability to perform that job, because I had to have trust in the chain of command. I had to be confident that if we ever receive such an order, that order would be necessary, it would be legal, it would be needed in the defense of the nation. So even at that tender age, I think, my leaders had instilled in me a sense of trust and confidence.
Welcome to Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Leadership is about helping those we lead do great things, and that begins with one of the most fundamental elements of leadership, trust. Today, I'm honored to be joined by U.S. Air Force General Robert Kehler. General Kehler is a graduate of Penn State University and holds a master's degree in public administration. He served as the Commander of United States Strategic Command. General Kehler is regarded as a leader of deep character and competence. Today, we're discussing what it takes to build trust and confidence in your leadership. This is an episode you will not want to miss. General Kehler, thank you for joining me today on the Science of Leadership, and thank you for your service to our nation.
Well, you're welcome, Tom. I appreciate being invited, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, let me start with this. In our previous conversation, you shared with me the critical role that developing trust and confidence in your leadership holds in being an effective leader. Would you explain to our listeners what you mean by that?
Well, leadership is about motivating and inspiring human beings. It's about people, and sometimes we make it scientific when we discuss it, but it's really about the human element. And it's about that motivation and inspiration from a leader to get people to do something. And it's about achieving a goal or an objective. And it's often at great risk. Sometimes it's at great personal danger to themselves or maybe risk to their organization. Those people have got to have trust and confidence in their leader. If they don't, in my experience, that leader at best will be ineffective and at worst will ultimately fail.
Can you differentiate between the two, trust and confidence? How do you view them as separate yet intertwined?
Well, they're definitely intertwined, but let me start with trust for just a second. Character is the foundation of trust. And when I would talk to our young military leaders, I would remind them that our military academies all have similar sayings. We tell our young leaders that we don't lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. And I think that's as good a way as any to describe character. And it's a simple way to describe it. And I think it's an important way to describe it, because without character, there can be no trust. So think about this in your personal life and how a lack of trust affects your entire relationship with another person. It certainly has been true in my life that if you don't trust someone, that puts that person in a different category from others that you might have a relationship with. We give our military leaders the authority to use deadly force, to give orders to our men and women to undertake missions that could reasonably result in the death of people, perhaps their own death. And we do not give that authority to people who lie, cheat, steal, et cetera, because if we did, in my experience, those men and women would not have the trust in their leaders that they need to accept those missions. We would not have the military that we have today. Regarding confidence, and you said this correctly, they're intertwined. Confidence is made up of a variety of factors. I think trust, I believe, is a foundational factor for confidence. But confidence is also built on competence. It's built on fairness. It's built on objectivity. I think the list goes on and on and on. Leaders who don't have the skill or the understanding of their role, who are abusive or toxic. And by the way, you can be demanding without being abusive or toxic. Leaders who create a sour climate, who are in it for themselves, are ultimately ineffective. And all of those go into not only trust, but confidence. There's an intangible factor here as well in trust and confidence. And I think leaders who take care of the troops, that's what we always talk about in my world with a uniform, or what you hear used sort of in the general conversation these days is somebody has your back.
Mm-hmm.
Those people generate trust and confidence. That doesn't mean you support your people, whether they're right or wrong. Your priority has to be mission success, but you also have to advocate tirelessly for your people and always treat them with respect and compassion. And I think those factors together, when demonstrated in a real way by leaders, build trust and confidence in the people you're leading.
Thank you for expounding on that. That's very rich descriptions. General Kehler, I know you've led in really incredibly high stakes environments, space, nuclear deterrence, global security, big areas. Can you share a moment from your career that really highlights what it looks like to establish or even have that trust and confidence?
Yeah, that's a great question. let me do something that maybe you wouldn't expect. You would think that maybe I would start at the end of my career to cite that kind of an example, but I'm going to go
Sure.
all the way back to my time as a second lieutenant, brand
Oh,
new to the United States Air Force, to use as an example for why trust and confidence are important. So when I was a brand new second lieutenant, I was assigned as a missile combat crew member in a Minuteman ICBM wing in Montana. And of course, people have asked me this over the years, did you ever sit there and ponder the consequences of what it would mean if you were ever asked to launch those missiles? And the answer was yes, but that was not something that those of us in the crew force spent a lot of time dwelling on. Privately, I think everyone understood those issues and understood the responsibilities that we had, but we never sat around and talked about the potential here of what it would be like if we ever actually had to launch the missiles. But when I began sitting on alert in a launch control center, it struck me that trust and confidence, I didn't think of it maybe in those terms those days, but trust and confidence were critical to my ability to perform that job, because I had to have trust in the chain of command. I had to be confident that if we ever received such an order, that order would be necessary, it would be legal, it would be needed in the defense of the nation. So even at that tender age, I think my leaders had instilled in me a sense of trust and confidence. And it was through their actions. It was through the way we talked about our core values and our standards. It was their insistence on discipline, operational discipline, and personal discipline. It was about adhering to those high standards. It was about understanding the laws of armed conflict. Everything they did in hindsight to prepare me to sit in that missile launch control center contributed to the trust and confidence that I had in that dreadful and hopefully never to be realized day if we were ever told or ordered to launch those missiles. And by the way, that experience shaped my views of the need for trust and confidence from the tip of the spear backwards all the way up to being the commander of strategic command and in fact above. And I think, as you know, the commander of strategic command has a very short chain of command. It's the commander of Stratcom, the Secretary of Defense, and the President of the United States. And that chain of command, I reflected on that, not when I was a second lieutenant, of course, but much
sure.
later when I was sitting in that seat. That's a pretty short chain of command. And that trust and confidence, by the way, goes both ways in the chain of command. It doesn't just go from the top down, it goes the other way as well.
Yeah. Thanks for that vivid kind of picture. And I can imagine sitting out there in Montana, sort of desolate place, because where the Minutemen silos were located, usually were not the finest of digs and fairly remote. So I can imagine that was somewhat of a hardship tour. But also just your point of it's in the little things as much as anything, right? That because you said all these different facets that contributed to your trust and confidence in your leaders, from core values to how they carried themselves, all that it creates this structure that promotes trust and confidence. But it's all these little things. In this moment, I'm reminded of the importance of the rivet. When we come to like a fuselage of a airframe, if you don't have those little rivets holding together your aircraft, you're going to be in trouble. Or the small, even when we talk about Columbia coming back in and disintegrating when coming in from orbit, a little nick in the ceramic coating of the space shuttle resulted in catastrophic failure and the death of those astronauts. It was just a tiny thing, but it's those tiny things often that create the very important stuff like trust and confidence. So anyway, as you were talking, that was kind of rolling around in my mind.
Yeah, leaders are being observed every minute. And those things that leaders do are being seen every minute. And so I think at some level, a leader is constantly being assessed by those he leads or she leads. And so I think that sometimes we forget that. And that doesn't mean you can't relax and be yourself, because you have to.
Sure.
It's the human factors, right? This is about leadership. But I think that you have to recognize as a leader that every one of those things contributes to not just the trust and confidence that your people have in you, but your overall effectiveness as a leader. And your example reminds me of the old saying about the shoe, the nail, the shoe, the horse, the rider, the battle. I mean,
Right.
they are all linked. It's, in the medical world, the ear really is connected to the ankle somehow. I'm not sure how that works, but I think you're right. It's really, we forget sometimes as leaders that even when you're not on the leadership official stage, people are watching you. In my own experience, of course, when I would take my uniform off and it would be a Saturday morning and I would head off to the commissary or go to the grocery store or even go downtown, you never knew if the checkout person was a family member of somebody who you were leading out in the unit. And so you were constantly being observed and assessed.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many of well, I probably could if I went back and looked in the data, but among the 4 stars that I interviewed, how many of them said, people are always watching. They're always watching you, what you're doing. How will you react in this moment? How will you react to this stimulus? Because whatever you do sets the standard. That becomes the standard. If you operate at a low standard, that's where the standard will be, whatever you're doing. So yeah, this idea that people are always watching and they're trying to figure out how are you going to respond because you're the example.
Yeah, a mentor of mine once said to me, and I this stuck with me. He said, they might not remember what you say, but they'll remember how you look. And I think that's true too. If you come into the room and you look like things are bad and you're sweating and you're agitated and all of those things, and then you say everybody remain calm, there's a difference here between how you look and what you're saying. And so it's an entire package. You've got to be mindful of how you react and what you say and how you look and your demeanor all the time.
Yeah, I remember you sharing that precept, how you look. When we talked previously, you spoke specifically about 9/11 and how that came to mind. That, okay, this is an unprecedented situation. Here you are in this leadership position, and people are looking to you, and you're trying to mitigate your own responses, right? Because we as humans, we've got our own response, but then there's the responsibility of I'm in this leadership role, and people are looking to me for stability, for psychological safety, for those sorts of things. They're looking for somebody they can trust, that they can be confident in, who's going to be a leader, right? And how you had to on 9/11 with that. So I definitely remember that wisdom. Hey, I'm breaking into the podcast conversation here to share with you an exciting announcement. If you've been following the Science of Leadership podcast for a while, you've heard me talk about the book I've been working on. Well, I'm delighted to share that after over 3 years of work, my book, The 4 Stars of Leadership, is finally available. I'm so proud of this book and what it represents. I'm certain that you're going to find it immensely interesting and helpful as a guide on your journey to becoming a better leader. Seriously, you don't want to miss this book. I'm including a link to the book in the description. I hope you'll order your copy today. And please share it with others who might be interested. Also, please be sure to share your thoughts about the book with me. Now, let's get back to this interesting conversation on the science of leadership. Well, General Kehler, we've kind of hit on why it's so important, right? Why is it imperative to build trust and confidence? I mean, because ultimately, the people that we're attempting to lead don't have trust and confidence in us. They're not going to follow, especially when times get hard. But I wonder if you have another story from your career, a time when having that trust and confidence was absolutely imperative for mission success.
Yeah, so if you take the second lieutenant story, if you take Second Lieutenant Kehler and fast forward that, although fast forward took just under 39 years, but if you fast forward from that, and by the way, in hindsight, that was really fast forwarded. It's amazing how quickly that all passed. But my second lieutenant story is really about the foundations of nuclear deterrence. And the paradox of the nuclear age is really still with us. In order to deter the use of nuclear weapons, we have to be prepared to use them. And deterrence can't be based on a bluff. It has to be credible in the eyes of the adversary. It's got to be credible in the eyes of our own citizens. It's got to be credible in the eyes of our own leaders. And much of that credibility depends on human factors. So the men and women at the tip of the nuclear spear have to be ready to do their wartime jobs. And the chain of command needs to have trust and confidence that they can and will do their wartime jobs if it's ever necessary. So at the bottom, well, actually at the tip of the spear, the bottom of the rank structure, but the tip of the spear, the people have to have trust and confidence in the entire chain of command. At the top of the command chain, but at the back end of the spear, those people need to understand and have trust and confidence that those orders will be carried out, and that the hardware capabilities are there, that the human beings are there to do it. Because, by the way, ultimately deterrence is based on human factors. It depends on that, and the credibility of our deterrent rests squarely on the shoulders of the people who are at the tip of that spear. They recognize that, by the way. That was another second lieutenant epiphany that I had, was that there was a lot of responsibility placed on my shoulders. So what about that trust and confidence? Well, what we tell our young people is, look, there's always room for a question, but there's never room for a corrosive doubt about whether they should have trust and confidence in their leaders or their motivations. So in the nuclear deterrence business, as I sat at that end of the command chain, that trust and confidence is really unique. Only the President of the United States can authorize the use of nuclear weapons. And an order to use a nuclear weapon from the president goes directly to the forces. So even though I was always in the chain of command, the authority to use those weapons never was passed down the chain of command. If the President of the United States decides to use a nuclear weapon in combat and orders that to be so, that order goes directly to the forces. So there's an interesting relationship there about the trust and confidence directly from the President of the United States to those people at the tip of the spear. And that resonates with you the higher up in the nuclear business that you get. That's why it's always important to make sure that those at the tip of the spear have trust and confidence in the command chain. But there's a unique factor that goes along with that when we are talking about nuclear deterrence and the consequences of failure. So it's that comes home to every commander of strategic command, every commander of strategic air command who preceded those commanders at strategic command, and it will stay that way, I believe, as long as we have and require nuclear weapons for deterrence.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, you've got people who are out there right now, literally right now, somewhere, right? And they have to believe that if that order comes, they have to follow through on that order, which requires, just as you say, that trust and confidence that this is appropriate, that this is the right move, this so forth, so that they act, right? Because again, theoretically, in those situations, time is a really important factor too. And so, yeah, the magnitude of that, I think that's a really powerful example where that rubber meets the road, as it were.
And when I was wearing a uniform, and even since then, when I get around some of our policymakers, I remind them that the rhetoric that they use in public is being heard by those people at the tip of the spear. And so sometimes I get concerned that, again, if leaders are being observed all the time, and what they say and how they act and what they do and all of those things are being observed all the time, then sometimes what is acceptable in the political world is a difficult transition to transition that over into the military world where that trust and confidence can't be shaken. And so they have an obligation, I think, and I think most that I've talked to understand that, and they understand that that they're being heard and listened to, and they certainly understand that better than I did. But I think that puts an additional burden on the leaders in uniform to make sure that they can help the people at the tip of the spear and all the way up and down the chain sort of understand the context that they're operating in, and to continue to reinforce the fundamentals of trust and confidence and make sure that they understand and can help them put in context sort of what they hear in the public domain, as opposed to maybe the standards and the core values and things that they are told are essential for them to do their jobs. It's an interesting balancing point. And by the way, that's part of what it means to be in the military of the United States of America, is that we have political and civilian masters. That's the way it works, and everyone accepts that. Sometimes it's, especially when these heated arguments are going on in the political world, we have to, I think, provide a steadying hand sometimes in the military world so that people can continue to put that in context. And as I say, there's always room for conversation. There's always room for questions, but there's not room for sort of corrosive activity that would corrode the trust and confidence.
Yeah. Yeah, because as you mentioned earlier, if you undermine that, then what are you left with? Well, what we've been talking about, what you've been sharing, really aligns beautifully with what the research tells us. Studies show that trust is the foundation, really, of effective leadership. Without it, influence, which is, as we talked about on this podcast before, the heart of leadership, can't occur. There was a study in 2002 where Dirks and Ferrin found that when team members trust their leaders, they're more likely to accept influence, perform better, and remain committed. Trust also predicts psychological safety, and I hit on that just a minute ago, but and we've discussed that previously on the podcast, particularly with regard to the work of Dr. Amy Edmondson at Harvard, and she's shown that psychological safety is the number one driver of team learning and innovation. In short, trust isn't just a virtue, it's a strategic advantage. Now, if we shift to what the science says about building confidence, because as we hit on, they're two intertwined things. In their research, Jim Kouzes, who was on the podcast recently, and Barry Posner found that leaders who are seen as credible, who do what they say they will do, if you will, are far more likely to earn the confidence of their team. So consistency in that regard is key. When we're inconsistent, it creates fear, it creates instability, creates a lot of problems that we don't want, certainly as leaders. So that's important. There's also some fascinating work from Meyer, Davis, and Sherman, which broke trust down into three components, which our listeners will be familiar with these. Competence, character, and benevolence, which within my own research we would refer to as caring. And leaders earn confidence when people believe they're capable, honest, and truly have their team's best interests at heart. As I mentioned, my own work with you, the 4 stars, when added to that communication, to these three other things from the previous study I mentioned. It's just an exceptional framework for leaders. So all this really works together to create a milieu. It's not the trust and confidence aren't the only two factors, but without them, it's fascinating. I think in leadership, there's no one thing, right? There's no, if you do this one thing, which is the problem with a lot of books on the market, I think they say, if you do this one thing, you'll be successful. That's a lie. There's no single thing in leadership that if you do that one thing, you'll be successful. There are a lot of things if you don't do, you'll be unsuccessful. And so trust and confidence, I think, is a great example of that.
I couldn't agree more. When I was assessing our young people for leadership capacity and leadership opportunities, I had a very similar set of factors that I looked at, and they, as you wouldn't be surprised, of course, they had competence and character. Character was first.
Mhm.
I had vision as well because I always felt like a leader needed to be able to see the way forward.
Mhm.
And I think that leaders constantly are dealing with risk, and they're constantly dealing with ambiguity, uncertainty, all those things in varying levels as you take on these difficult problems and you're trying to lead an organization or your people to some objective. But I always felt like character was still the foundation. Competence was clearly something that leaders needed to have. And by the way, both of those are highly visible, demonstrable attributes that leaders need to understand. That you must live those. You must live character and competence, and you have to demonstrate that you have a set of high standards and you have a set of foundational values. You enforce those standards in your organization. You have to be fair. You have to be impartial. You have to show that you know your mission, that you know the job, that you see a way ahead. And even if it's not the only way ahead, that you're able to guide an organization in a direction, because floundering is something that will lead to disaster, really. And you don't always have to make an immediate decision. I think you need to listen to your people. You need to listen to your subordinate leaders. You aren't the smartest person in the room. You may have the ultimate responsibility, but you're most likely not the smartest person in the room. And even if you are, I think it's important for you to have a collaborative environment where you are expecting your subordinates to voice their own views on things, and to you've empowered them to
Yeah.
be open with you. So all of those things, I think, listening is a critical attribute as well. You don't have to be the one who knows everything about every item out there. You won't be that person, but you have to know who to talk with, who does. And so I think all these are leadership attributes that are important. They all build trust and confidence. But ultimately, I think this gets back to character,
Mhm.
competence, and those factors that go with that you get to demonstrate on a day-to-day basis. If you are saying one thing, and that's the old say-do gap that we're all familiar with. You say one thing and go do something else, your people see that right away. These are smart people that you are leading, and it doesn't matter what your environment is. You are being assessed. So I think you just need to know that and live honestly.
As you were saying that, these people are smart people. I was thinking it would probably do a lot of leaders good to think my people are probably more observant than I recognize and are smarter than I give them credit. Because I see so many leaders who think they're going to pull a fast one on somebody, and all their people know. They all know, and they talk, and it just corrodes their leadership. So I think if people had character, we wouldn't have to. I wouldn't have to say this, if everybody had character, which we wish they did. But um, if nothing else, assume that they actually know more than you think they do, and observe more than you think they do, and maybe that could help some of these people out there with the lower levels of character at least behave in a better manner. I don't know. But this gets me to kind of the next section of our conversation, which is the practical points of doing this. And you've hit on some. Certainly, you've highlighted character is important, competence is important for a lot of people who are listening are probably early mid-career leaders, if you will. Do you have some really tangible, practical things that they can do to build trust and confidence from those that are leading?
First, I would again say you have to live the standards and the values that you profess. And I think that the beginning of any leadership task is to get your people not only to understand what it is that needs to be done and a way to approach getting it done, but I think they need to have that foundational understanding of who you are. And so you've got to live that. I think you have to live those standards and you have to live those values. I think you have to be fair. I think you have to be impartial. I think that you have to be consistent. I think that these wild swings that sometimes, I've been fortunate to have lots of leadership examples over my career. And one of the things that I always did was I would, in my own assessment of a leader, I would look at them and I would think to myself, if I'm ever in a leadership position, I'm going to do that they are doing. I'm going to approach my task that way. I've got lots of positive examples. But I've also been associated with some leaders where the other page in my book is I'll never do that if I'm ever in a leadership position. And very early on, again, back to my lieutenant days, I had a full colonel who was running the operations part of that missile wing, and we were having this very very in-depth, very consequential evaluation that was lasting about 2 weeks. It was SAC headquarters came in to evaluate the wing, and it was not just an operational readiness inspection, which was always sort of the big thing in our
Yeah.
military units, but this was a team of missile experts who would come in and they would take about 2 weeks and they would go into every nook and cranny. They would bring crew members into the simulator. They would give us these really hard evaluations in the simulators, and lots of people would have an opportunity to perform in front of
Yeah.
them. And I got that opportunity one time, and in fact more than once. But the first time I got that opportunity, I was still a second lieutenant. I was what was called a deputy missile combat crew commander. And we went into the simulator and we took a 4-hour simulation ride that we called it. And it's very similar to going into an aircraft simulator. They could throw all kinds of things at you that you'd never see in the field, hopefully never see in the field, all kinds of emergency situations. And ultimately, you had to demonstrate all of the things that you would do to go to war. And it was a very high stress environment for the crew members. It was done on purpose for that because that's a stressful scenario, as you would
Mhm.
imagine. And so my crew commander and I went through and we were outbriefed, and it was a very, very successful ride. We were graded as highly qualified, and we walked outside of the debrief room, and I expected there would be a band there and there would be all kinds of people and whatnot. And often the squadrons would have a contingent waiting for people to come out, and with almost like giving blood, they'd give you a little glass of orange juice and patch on the back. There was nobody there. I mean, there was nobody there. And I thought, here I am holding the weight of the free world on my shoulders and demonstrating that I can do it. And man, that's it. Okay, so get in the car and drive back to my apartment. And I'm sitting there, and time passes, and I thought, well, I feel good about myself. And the phone rang. And I answered it and I said, hello. And this voice said, Lieutenant Kehler. And I said, yes. And he said, well, this is Colonel so-and-so. And he said, listen, I got tied up. I'm really sorry I wasn't there when you came out of the box to congratulate you on your highly qualified ride. But I'm taking the opportunity now. I got near the phone. This is way before cell phones and all that stuff. I got near the phone and he said, I just wanted to call and let you know that you did a great job and I appreciate it. And I wrote that down in my book. I thought, if I am ever in that kind of a leadership position, I will do that. And so fast forward, I'm now a squadron commander of an ICBM unit. I'm a lieutenant colonel. We are going through a similar thing. And not only did we have contingents there to greet everybody when they were coming out, but I made it a point to not only call the member who had done a good job, or even if they didn't, I called them too. But also I asked for those who had family, I asked for them to put their spouse on. And I said the same thing to them about how important it was and how responsible they were and what a good job they did. And so I think it's things like that that make people understand that you mean what you say. And I think all of those things are important. It's important, I think, to show that you are human as well. And someone also once told me, look, it's okay to get angry if you're in a leadership position. It's okay to get sad. It's okay to be happy. You can be all those things. You just have to put that in the context of what you're doing and how you're doing it. And so don't pretend like you have no emotions. It's okay to show emotion. Just be careful how you do it. And
Yeah.
don't be toxic, and don't, be careful how you do it. And so, and sometimes you're going to lose your cool
Mhm.
sometimes, and because you're a human being. But if you have built that trust and confidence in who you are and how you go about your business and what you demand of your people as well as what you demand of yourself, I think that sort of smooths out those parts where there's a where there's a spike. And
Yeah.
sometimes there will be a spike, and it's okay to do that. You don't have to pretend like you never get emotionally tied into what's going on. Just you got to be careful about how you do it, and you got to make sure it's in the context of who you are.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, one final thing: if you mess something up, say it. Hey, we didn't do that right, or I didn't do that right. And I think that was another thing that if you set expectations and then you somehow don't live up to that, and I'm not talking about crime here, I'm talking about
Sure.
how you lead. Because someone else once said to me, the first time somebody runs in your door when you're a commander and says, so and so just did this thing, which is awful, ask yourself the first question is what that is potentially a crime. And if it is, well, you got to go a certain way. If not, then you've got some flexibility here, maybe about how you respond. And so anyway, all of these I think are life lessons that you learn as time passes about consistency and being honest and admitting mistakes and all of those things. I think that be who you say you are, be who you want them to be as well. And I think that goes a long way.
Those are brilliant. I usually have, some practical things that I outline based on the science, what the science has shown. You hit every single one of them. Be consistent, be transparent, admit your mistakes, deliver on your promises, as do what you say you're going to do, and then show you care. And you just outlined every single one of those brilliantly with not only outline but fill those out. So thank you for doing that. I was as you were speaking specifically about this being human, about it's okay to become agitated without being unprofessional. That's as you were saying, recognize the context in which you're operating. I was thinking about it's this idea of the piggy bank in a sense, right? Like if we spend the large majority of our time on the positive side, of the ledger, then when those moments come where we're not perfect, where we are a little bit rougher around the edges than we would want to be, those spikes, as you said, we can extract from that piggy bank of good favor, if you will, from those that we're leading. They know. I mean, it's the same with any relationship that we have, I think, in a marriage. For those of us who are married or have been, if you spend most of the time building each other up on those rare occurrences when there's conflict, you get through that a lot better. They understand, hey, this is a moment. This isn't a pattern. This isn't their character. This is this present moment, and you can work through it and get beyond it. I think it's when in relationships, whether leadership relationships or otherwise, people spend all their time in that negative space. Then when those spikes occur, it just fractures everything and there's no recovery. So anyway, I was just thinking about that, and that gets a little bit, I mean, that's a bigger context, but anyway, I appreciate you sharing that because it gave me the opportunity to revisit that idea in my mind.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in those moments when there is something unexpected or something that hasn't gone the way you wanted it to, or something that someone has done something that doesn't reflect sort of them or the unit or mission accomplishment, etc. I mean, sometimes there are going to be failures. I mean, it's just the way it is, and you would hope that they are infrequent, and you would hope that the consequences of those failures are not huge. So, but in some cases here, and I never had the opportunity to command the people who were in direct combat, but my friends who have, those consequences can be extraordinarily grave if a mistake is made, or even if a mistake isn't made. I mean, those consequences are different. There's a different category of things here when there are casualties involved, for example,
Mm.
or fatalities that are involved. So I think that as a leader, though, you need to expect those kinds of things to happen. Something is going to happen along the way here that is unexpected. Although it wasn't as a result of combat, I have commanded units where there have been fatalities, and pretty ugly fatalities, as a matter of fact. And it is much like 9/11, where that's the point where a leader has not only a responsibility, but a real opportunity to lead. And those moments, I think, turn out to be defining for a leader because you need to expect that. You can't believe that as a leader in any job doing anything, that everything is going to unfold perfectly. It's not going to happen. That's not the world. That's not the
Yeah.
world we live in. So, how you manage those times when it's either some extreme thing has happened or some failure has occurred, I think you need to pre plan that in your own mind. How am I going to respond to these kind of things? And then I think it's consistency. So those are difficult times, and I think that I have seen I have in my own experience with a base environment where I was a wing commander, where we had a very tragic occurrence in our base housing. We actually had a triple murder suicide
Mm.
in base housing, and it was a tenant unit of mine. It was not my direct command unit, but as the wing commander, I had responsibility
Sure.
to provide for those tenant units. And honestly, the tenant unit was mostly a group of scientists and engineers and folks like that who had a different leadership requirement actually on a day-to-day basis. And they were struggling. I mean, they were really struggling with all of this. It was, like I say, it was very ugly. It involved children, and so it was very ugly. And we basically stepped into all of that and took over for them because, and they were very appreciative of that because I think that we had the leadership skills. We had the leadership team in place. We had the people who had confronted those kinds of things before. It was much more the kind of things you find in the operational military as opposed to the support part of the military. And so anyway, I just think there are examples there. Those things are going to happen, whether they're part of an expectation out of your mission set or whether it just happens. So those emotional highs and lows are going to occur there. I think you've got to set the context for that from the very beginning about how you will respond and make sure that people understand that there's a context for you when you get to those spikes as well.
Yeah, I don't think anyone goes into a leadership position expecting that sort of, just as you describe it, a tragic, horrific event like that. And so you do have to expect the unexpected in a sense. At least be prepared that today's going to hold something that may punch me in the mouth. How am I going to respond? General Kehler, before we close out our conversation, I was wondering if you might share an entertaining story you told me when we talked before. You were talking about the importance of competence, and you shared this story that eventually led to a T-shirt that you got for Christmas that said, "I know what I'm doing." Would you mind sharing that story? Because I think it's hilarious.
Sure. Well, let me give you the moral to the story first, because because that's really the context for the story. So the moral to the story is this one. I was in the room as a fairly senior officer when a senior officer and mentor of mine was talking to new uh, generals and admirals, brand new brigadiers and rear admirals. And he said something I thought was extraordinary. He looked at them and he said, "Sometimes you can forget who you are." And that was another one. I wrote that down in my book. Sometimes you can forget who you are. And his point was, no matter where you are as a leader, you have to stay grounded in who you are. That's the moral to the story here. You got to stay grounded. So I had just taken command of Air Force Space Command. I am a brand new 4-star. It is a Saturday morning, and my late wife and I had driven off the base. We were downtown doing something, I don't know what it was, some store we had gone to, and because I'm sure there was something we absolutely needed. And so we're coming back onto the base. We go through the gate. Everything is fine. We are driving to our quarters. And I'm driving, but I am saying to her that after a week in the job, I felt like I knew what I was doing, that I felt comfortable doing the job. Because I think anytime you take a new responsibility as a leader, you go through a little bit of time. I used to tell people that you come back from the reception and you've got, your lips are blue from the cake icing and you're sitting there in the office all by yourself and you're wondering if you're up to this. And so I'm feeling pretty comfortable here. I've got 4 stars on my shoulder and I am looking at her and I am saying to her, I really think I know what I'm doing. And the next words out of her mouth were stop sign, which I had just gone through. I had ignored it completely. I just blew right through it. Now, the good news was we're sort of on a side street on the base. We're not in base housing. We're driving down the street on our way to base housing. And so my wife decided that I needed to be reminded of that moment. And so at Christmas time, I am opening a package and in there is a T-shirt that says, "I know what I'm doing." And I still have that T-shirt. I wear it, as a matter of fact. And it's a good reminder for me that you got to be humble and you have to stay grounded. And I think that's, by the way, one of the most powerful things that I took from leaders over the years was some sense of being a bit humble about what they're doing as well. And I think that's really important, particularly the more stars or the more titles you get. It doesn't matter whether they are stars or titles or whether they are degrees or what it is. As you rise in the leadership ranks, I think you need some humility associated with all of that as well. And people see that. People can see that all of you is not tied up with what you're wearing on your shoulder or what it says on your diploma. And I think that's critically important as well.
Great way to end out our conversation. General Kehler, as before, it's been an honor and a privilege to get to speak with you. Thank you for joining me on the Science of Leadership today.
You're quite welcome. And I'm looking forward to talking with you again.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.